Welcome to FinTalk, everyone. I'm Renarda Joy, your host for tonight's and this 4-week series. Throughout this series, we'll delve into essential topics related to financial literacy and wealth building strategies. Now, tonight's conversation, we're kicking it off with the power of self compassion. Before we explore this conversation, I want to ask you a question. When was the last time you showed yourself compassion? Now, I want you to really sit and think about that. Now, why do you think self compassion is important, especially in today's world? Now, I want you to share your thoughts in the comments as we begin to explore this very topic with our guests. Now, before I bring our guest on and introduce him properly, I strongly suggest that you grab some pen and paper and be prepared to take copious notes because this guest, he's known to give us valuable information. So allow me to properly introduce him. Dr. Michael G. Thomas Jr. is an accredited financial counselor and a lecturer at the University of Georgia. His research focuses on financial empathy and self-compassion, data visualization effects on financial behavior, and the connection between brain function and money. Dr. Thomas's philosophy on effectively interacting with money can be summed up in his TED Talk, Financial Empathy, Understanding the Story Beneath the Numbers. Utilizing financial empathy as a process for active listening and the creation of client-focused financial recommendations are reflected in two financial literacy and capability programs he helped create, Money Dogs and Discovering Money Solutions. Dr. Thomas is also the founder of Modem Solutions, a virtual financial coaching service. He's been providing services since 2015. He is also the author of Black Financial Culture, Building Wealth from the Inside Out. I can't wait for him to get into that. It's a must read. Join me in welcoming Dr. Thomas. Welcome.
How's it going? Thanks for having me back. I appreciate
Yeah,
it.
you were
It's
actually
been a
called
minute.
out. It's been a while, but welcome. So let's jump right in. So, Dr. Thomas,
Absolutely.
tell us why self-compassion and why now?
Yeah, I think that there are a number of reasons. One, economically, there have been a lot of struggles nationally that just aren't struggles of individual households. There were recent reports that came out in terms of, and I've been tracking the national debt for a very long time now. I actually use it to have certain conversations with my class as it relates to understanding even how our country was founded. Our country was actually founded on creating a credit system. So we're going all the way back to after the Revolutionary War. The United States was actually really struggling at that point in time because we couldn't get outside countries to invest in the United States because we didn't have a lot of stability. So Alexander Hamilton at that time had looked at what was being done in Europe, but a lot of folks didn't want to do what Europe was doing because that's why we left Europe, right? But there was really no other way to create cohesiveness if there wasn't stability in a particular means of currency. So this credit issue that we're currently dealing with isn't something that's brand new. It's actually the basis of the founding of this nation.
Mhm.
But I think it's very important for individuals who are at the household level also have to understand that you're not in this alone in terms of some of the harsh realities of what we're dealing with. Literally, I went somewhere. No, we went to the Atlanta Braves opening baseball game this past weekend, and tickets are not cheap. Parking's not cheap. To feed a family of four, that was literally $100. It was $20 for all of us. And that was just for food. That wasn't for a bottle of water. And so I'm sitting here and I'm trying to enjoy the game, but there was a part of me that was thinking, like, who can really afford to go to a ball game
Mhm.
and to be okay with spending $250, $300 or whatever it may be just to be in attendance? And we don't have like these extraordinary seats. We're like way up on high,
And we're talking
right?
about one day. This is just for one event, one
Yeah,
day.
yeah. This is just one event. And then as I'm cruising around town, I went to go get something for dinner the other day. Again, it was like $20. I'm like, yo, what's really going on here? And I'm in a position to where we're not struggling financially things of nature. But for me, it causes pause because I'm like, well, how can other people effectively afford this stuff? And now if we go back and we look at the data on credit utilization, that's actually skyrocketing. Our
Mhm.
nation is skyrocketing in its utilization of debt.
Mhm.
Households are skyrocketing in their utilization of debt as well, just to be able to make ends meet and to piece out and carve out some semblance of a life, well-being, and feeling as if I can actually do things and I can move, I can be outside, like it's nice right now, right? Um, but I just want to let people know that we are definitely, you're not alone as you're navigating this process. From a household level all the way up to the highest levels of our government, everybody's struggling with the debt issue at this point in time. We
Mhm.
can make it seem like it's a one-off thing, but even around the world, countries are struggling
Mhm.
with being able to have credit in order to move their nations along as well. This is actually a shared experience, and I think right now more than ever, it is so incredibly important to lean into this notion of self compassion, simply because if we just listen to the narratives that are in the news, what we may be reading on our phones and things of that nature, the narratives are incredibly divisive. Um, the narratives can be presented as such as if you're the only community, like the Black community is the only community struggling. I
Mhm.
work in this space. The Black community is not the only
It's
community
not,
struggling.
no.
And so what happens though, if you think it's only me and everybody else is doing good, you start thinking that you're lacking, right? And then
Mhm.
what happens is that oftentimes when people start thinking that they're lacking, they start blaming themselves in many instances for this perception of lack compared to someone else. And then
Mhm.
what happens is that that creates an emotional and psychological deficit. And the further away we feel as if we're from the finish line, it's easier to lose motivation and not even want to fight, not even want to try. And we see that in the data in literature as it relates to socioeconomic status. Individuals who are in the lowest rungs of socioeconomic status are more susceptible to financial shock repeatedly over the course of the year. That creates stress, right? And then oftentimes what happens is that we utilize our resources and money to engage in self-soothing to address the stress, but it never addresses the issue, right? And so what happens is that this vicious cycle kind of perpetuates itself and we get further and further behind financially. And unfortunately, what happens is that we recognize that there's us in this. And what we tend to do is shame ourselves because of how we perceive that other people are going to perceive the mess I've put myself in. And then what happens is that when we start shaming ourselves, we start hiding.
Mhm.
And when we start hiding, we don't congregate, we don't seek help, we don't utilize the resources that we need and the tools to address the complex nuances of our issue because it's not always just financial. Um, and we further exacerbate a situation. And so the reason why self-compassion, because I think that it's the ultimate form of agency,
Mhm.
meaning that I'm not going to wait for someone else to treat me kindly, gently, respectfully, and with warmth. Because the vast majority of conversations that we have on a daily basis are within ourselves. So before I ever interact with someone else, what does my internal self-talk actually sound like? How kind and warm and thoughtful and understanding am I of my circumstances and situation? But when we engage in this process of shame, which is I am the mistake, not I made a mistake, which that phrase was popularized by Brene Brown, but there are other researchers that came before her that laid the context for that same phrasing. Then what happens is that we don't think that we're worthy of redemption. So even if somebody comes into your life and then they see you and they want to sow into you and they see you beautifully and they see where you can grow, you can't even receive it because you're so bounded by self shame and indictment and thinking that you're deserving
Mhm.
of every negative or wrong. It's almost like a self punishment that's perpetual with no end. And so I just want to remind people first, I don't know anybody who's perfect financially, relationally. If you're a person of faith, spiritually, I don't know any perfect Christians. Um, the primary difference, though, is that they can differentiate themselves between this notion of becoming, which is going to look a lot like this, but you trend up. That's the whole point. It's going to be all over the place, but you're still trending up, right?
Well, let me
And so,
just jump in and say a lot of times, just to kind of jump on the perfection part, social
yep,
media has really taken over by large, where people are just like, I see so and so is doing this and they have this. And most times it's just photo ops, it's not, you
sure.
don't know. And in addition to that, you don't know what road they actually had to travail for that. And would you even be willing to go down that path? So I
I
think
would,
social media is definitely another corporate to this as well.
absolutely. The thing about social media is that individuals have learned what marketers have always known is that if I can trigger an emotional response in my viewer, I can get clicks, I can get likes, I can get views. So sensationalism sells. So whether or not it's true or not, I know people right now where they will take a trip and they'll take multiple pictures walking through the Atlanta airport and wherever they're going, and they'll actually repurpose the trips to make it seem like they're always traveling.
Yep.
Okay. And so what's fascinating to me is that when we don't feel as if we're enough, we try to seek other people who we perceive have a level of confidence, have a level of have maybe some bravado about themselves, or that person seems like they have it all together, and then try to live vicariously through whatever it is that they're doing while I'm trying to get my stuff together. But you've never been to this person's home. You've never casually gone like experienced a day with it. Like this is Renarda, this is different. When I was growing up, you couldn't hide, you couldn't fake stuff.
Oh.
It's either you had it or you didn't have it, right?
Mhm.
And you had to show that you had it. Now we live in a space where we can play like we have it, and people actually believe that we have it and create these psychological and emotional deficits based on this perception of something that's quality or that's amazing. But you cannot base who you are and where you are in life on what you perceive, unfortunately, on social media, because people are not utilizing social media to live their authentic selves necessarily. Oftentimes, it's a ploy, it's a brand, it's a marketing scheme. Because as soon as something negative happens in that person's lives, what do they say? Will you respect our privacy?
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like, I find that incredibly ironic.
Right.
I thought we were about showing the real,
Transparent.
being transparent. Or you'll see, and again, when I say this with all sensitivity when it comes to weight. So you'll see somebody who was obese and they'll say, I'm proud of who I am and this, that, and the other. And then they disappear. And then all of a sudden they show up on social media and they're like 70 pounds lighter. And now they're sharing a different narrative. I feel better than I ever felt. I have more energy. But you were just 6 months prior talking about how you felt amazing in
Right.
your initial form and how you should, love your body and love yourself. And the only reason I say this, because understanding this audience, my family struggles with hypertension. My family struggles with diabetes. My family struggles with heart issues. You cannot tell me that someone, especially if that was my family,
Mhm.
and someone had disappeared and they showed up and now they're fine and fit and all these different things. It was probably because they went to the doctor
Mm-hmm.
and they had full-blown diabetes, they had full-blown hypertension, or they had full-blown cardiovascular issues. We
Mm-hmm.
never shared the in-between information, but yet relationally, oh, so-and-so's been together, and then now they're getting divorced. Like, how did that happen? Because you don't get all the information. Even if you see me, you don't know if I have wealth.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know. I work at UGA, written a book. I've been able to do some good things. You don't know unless you see my financials.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know. And so, and I say this all the time, wealth is a calculation, financial wealth, that is, and not a perception. You don't know unless you pull receipts. And so, until you're able to pull receipts on someone's curated life, I would argue not to trust that curated perspective. And there's several studies that have shown that seeing those things actually overstimulates us. And so our dopamine levels run rampant. Going on a social media fast for 3 days, 4 days, or even 5 days, if you can manage it, I think is something that everyone should strive to do, because what you'll find is that you center yourself, you're more focused on your life and the things that you want to work on and what you want to do. You start to hear your own thoughts
Mm-hmm.
in a clearer way, and you're not being influenced by tons of narratives and tons of messages that are just clickbait and trying to insinuate or stoke fear
Mm-hmm.
or levels of joy, because it has to be an emotional state. Somebody has to be in an emotional state in order to take action. If you're ever neutral, you're kind of like, no, I'm good.
Right. But they know how to hit exactly those pain points.
You have to touch on those to get people to take action, either extreme joy, extreme fear, whatever it may be. And that's the space that we live in. So we need to understand the game that's being played so that we can know it when we see it and when we're being played. Then we can choose, do I want to continue with the game or I want to step back from it? But that should be a choice, not someone navigating a system and not even understanding that you're actually in a system that's driving your emotional state. And that's why you're not feeling well. That's why you're not spending effectively and all these other different things. You have to understand the game that you're playing, because unfortunately, nobody else is going to tell you.
Wow. Okay. So now that we understand the importance of self-compassion, let's kind of dial back just a little bit and explain what is self-compassion. Like, we're talking about this, and I'm sure we've kind of touched on it, but I want to make it very crystal clear to our viewers. Like, how can it positively impact our financial decisions and our overall well-being?
Absolutely. Well, compassion in and of itself is a gentleness, kindness, and warmth in which we treat we treat other people. That's based on having a unique understanding about that person's circumstances or situation. So when we think about empathy, there are three levels of empathy. There's um, what is the I'm kind of drawing a blank right now. There's the first level of empathy is the understanding empathy, right? So I'm just understanding, is we would say that this is like a car salesman or whatever it may be. I'm understanding the need of the person so that I can make the sale basically. The second level empathy is affective empathy. That's emotional empathy, meaning that I'm able to connect emotionally to the circumstances and situations of the individual. Oftentimes, empathy kind of stops there in the literature. But there is a third one, which is compassionate empathy, which is I understand, I feel, and now I'm moved to respond and to do something in the best interests of someone else. And gently, that's done with a level of kindness, warmth, gentleness, simply because I can't say that for this person to achieve this goal, they can do it the way that I do it. I need to understand enough about them so that I can create something potentially to help them achieve a goal in a way that works best for that individual, their cognitive capacity, their financial capacity, family related, social capital, meaning who can I connect them to get access to resources, things of that nature. All those things matter when it comes to creating an effective financial strategy. And it's not just a knowledge piece of it, which is where we spend a lot of time. So when it comes to this notion of self-compassion and why it's so important in our financial wellness journey, is that I don't know anybody who likes to do anything that they're not good at. And if you're just starting out on a financial journey, you have to understand you're bringing a lot of baggage with you up to the starting line. And once you start the race, what happens is you feel the weight of that baggage while you're running. Okay. And when we start, because we don't realize that we're carrying all of this baggage, we immediately feel as if, well, I knew I shouldn't have did this, right? You start speaking negatively to yourself about who you are, where you've been, why you may not be deserving of X, Y, and Z. And it's very rarely positive self-talk that we engage with. And if you're running a race and every step you're taking, you're saying something negative, I don't know how long you're going to keep up with the race. Right? So you don't have an opportunity to be fully refined by the journey, which is as you continue to go, some of that baggage falls off, the weight gets lighter, but even more importantly, you get stronger. But if you don't continue on the journey or with the race, then you never see the full completion and evolution of you becoming, utilizing some language from Michelle Obama, the best version of yourself financially. So if I'm engaging with self-compassion, that means that if I have emotional and psychological trauma, and let's just be very clear about what trauma is, it's woundedness. I've been wounded. Self-compassion allows for us to recognize our woundedness, not from a judgment standpoint, but understanding that it is a part of my lived experience. And that's okay. That emotion's okay. That emotion is real. But where I'm going and what I desire is real as well. Both can exist together. So while you're running that race, if you don't have something counteracting the negative thought, then that negative thought becomes bigger. It actually is the way that our brain is wired. And we have to be very intentional about rewiring our brain to put ourselves in the best position to be successful. So this notion of self-compassion is basically a recognition of, regardless of what I've done, regardless of where I've been, I'm still worthy of whatever this best that is yet to come for me. And that has to be a cornerstone perspective that you have to work into in terms of notions of worthiness. And there are really deeply seated reasons why someone may not feel worthy. And if that is the case for someone, then they would need to speak with a professional to embrace that vulnerability so they're not defined by it, but allow themselves to be refined by it, right? And then so what happens is that when we engage in self-compassion, our language changes, right? It's not, I'm not strong, it's, I'm not strong yet. Here we're going.
You kind of have to reverse engineer what you've been saying to turn that negative into positive. Like,
but an honest positive,
right.
not necessarily a mantra of X, because what happens is our brain's not stupid, right? Our brain knows when we're just kind of saying things where it's not rooted in truth, because there's no neurological stimulated response in the body. So we need to actually tap into moments and instances of success that we've had, and everyone has them. No one is without them. There have been times, if you look deeply in your own narratives or stories, there's a time that you created, there's something that you wanted really badly, that you sat down, you thought about it, you created a plan, you created a strategy, you worked for it, and you got the thing. And it was the most amazing thing that you've done, regardless of how small it is. It's still an important story. And what we do is we lean into those things because it reminds us also of who we are. And we can choose to be more of that thing. And as we navigate our journey, we're always going to deviate one way or the other. It's no different than a diet, right?
I
If I,
just go to the gym as an example. When you go to the gym,
yeah,
and if you don't go consistently, you'll never get to see the transformation that
well,
what you started off as your goal. Um,
consistency is the only thing that compounds, honestly. And so, to your point, if you just continue to show up and just take pride into showing up and not focusing on the end part, because we can't really control that necessarily because our bodies are different. Again, there's so much context. Like your body type can be very different from someone else's, going back to the social media piece. So if I'm watching, or even a female, men and women, men generally speaking have more muscle mass. Muscle mass burns fat more. So if we're both on a similar diet, and then you see me having these extraordinary gains and you're not, and if you're female or you're a woman, you can't then compare yourself with me, because now we have to understand the physiology of the individual and why that's happening. And that's where judgment comes in, because we're measuring things that we should not be measuring. We're comparing things that should not be comparing, that not comparing. And because of that, we have unhealthy expectations. And with unhealthy expectations, what happens is that we create these finish lines that may not be the appropriate finish lines for our journey initially, until we've developed the capacity to achieve more. And again, it happens in all domains. So that being said, maybe self-compassion is, it's okay that I don't lose 20 pounds this week.
right. Or
You know how people be. I know there's somebody right now that like the summer's coming up, they about to take a vacation or something, and they're like, how can I lose 20 pounds in 5 days? It's on somebody's search browser somewhere at some point.
they're Googling it right now.
But that's not realistic. And if we don't achieve it, then guess what?
You get discouraged.
You get discouraged, and it becomes another instance, a synapse, brain neurocircuitry that's rewiring that says that I'm not good enough. And then we reinforce that linkage that we have. The whole idea, the reason why we start slowly and get small wins is that because when we get these small wins, we're creating new synapses, new neurons in the brain that is success neurons, right? But if I set these lofty goals and I don't achieve them, then everything that I've always done and always known is the thing that's constantly being reinforced. That's why people say quitting is a habit. It actually is, because it's wired in your brain. So the whole idea of behavioral change, generally speaking, is brain change. And it takes time for the brain to change. That's why we start slow, gradually, with compassion and grace for ourselves. Have a good baseline in terms of, I know that I can sustainably do this. Like you said earlier, Renarda, let's just do this consistently. And then what happens magically is that, guess what? You did it, you enjoyed it. And actually your body then wants to do it again. And then you go a little bit further and then you enjoy it. What we do is, oh, I'm so far behind. Let me go work out for 3 hours at the gym. Let me try to save $1,000 or $1,500 or $2,500 in 2 months. And we don't really have the capacity to do that financially, cognitively, emotionally, time-wise. And we don't hit it. And then yet it's another instance of, I'm not successful. We have to recreate the paradigm 180 in the way that we navigate things and focus on, and you said this beautifully, consistency. I would like to add joy as well, having fun doing these things, and then also a compassionate, gentle, and warm response to self as you're navigating your journey. All those things are incredibly important.
Wow. Okay, so now that we have a clear understanding of the importance and what self-compassion is, let's delve into the significance of it in your financial journey. So how does practicing self-compassion influence the way that we approach money matters and shape our long-term financial goals? Let's explore this a little bit further, this connection.
Yeah. I think that the deepest and most meaningful connection is that self-compassion allows for us to engage in our vulnerabilities. And that's the power of self-compassion. is that I can see myself authentically without judgment, guilt, or shame. And if I can do that with something as simple as a budget or a spending plan, and I know that there's someone who's listening right now, is probably one of the main reasons why you don't want to do a budget or spending plan, because it reminds you of where you are. It reminds you of the past mistakes. It reminds you that, or you think to yourself, man, I should be so much further along, right? Those are very common, real human ways, not just engaging with money, but so many other domains in our life. And that's because we're engaging in self-shame and labeling. So what self-compassion does is that in the past, my past version of myself, we talk about our future self, but we never talk about oftentimes as our past version of self actually being distinguishably different from our current version of ourselves. And I would argue that you're no longer the past version of yourself. You've actually evolved, probably quite considerably. The issue oftentimes resides in our inability to engage in self-reflection. I like to say, study your game tape, just like we talk about athletes. Like if you're a football fan or whatever, don't you go watch tape? Don't you go, like, you're not prepared for X, Y, and Z. You didn't know that they were, like, we get so all over the place. But how often do we stop and watch our own game tape? Right? We want other people to do something that is incredibly difficult. And it takes a lot of mental toughness to develop that. But I would even argue that it's not even mental toughness. At a certain time, it's a level of compassion in terms of the way that I engage with it. I see what she did. She got me, right? Oh, or he got me. Caitlin Clark, she did step back. Boom, there was nothing I could do about it. It is what it is, right? But we'll go back to the game tape, think about how we can scheme and be better for it the next time. Because the next time, it may be a little bit better. It may not, but we're going to try.
But it's going to be a good time.
It's going to be a good time. It's the journey, right? But you see how I engage with that? I engage with that with a level of levity. I engage with that in a joking way. None of that was there's something wrong with me that's fixed. It was maybe I didn't defend good at that point. I see where my footwork is off. We can go back to the gym and work on that.
Right. You wasn't judgmental. What I love was you wasn't judgmental with yourself.
None of it was judgmental, because that's life's journey. We're all, I promise y'all, I am not perfect. I'm not. And one of the most powerful things that I've had to deal with in terms of even my own personal growth as an individual is to be able to deal with my deep wounds in such a way that allowed for grace and forgiveness, self-forgiveness, so that I could actually move forward. Because otherwise what's going to happen, you just continue to carry the baggage with you. And the weight just keeps building and building and building, and we can't bear it. So what self-compassion does, it allows for you to embrace your wounds in a way that's warm, that's kind, that's gentle, and oftentimes that's forward-thinking. Because what happens is that when we use compassion or self-compassion, is that when we're starting to feel stress, it can actually neutralize our stress response. And if we neutralize our stress response, we can actually start to transition our brain from the monkey brain in the back that's just always chattering and talking about all the negative stuff, to then moving it to the thinking brain, which is our prefrontal cortex, that allows for us to take a deep breath, slow down, and then think about how we can move forward gradually, slowly, one step at a time until we get there. And so really at the end of the day, that's the power of self-compassion. And what people will come to recognize is that also is the power of agency. Agency is this notion of that I am an individual that can take action. I am the commander of my ship. I can do all these extraordinary things. But if we're constantly existing in notions of fear, self-doubt, um, elements of unworthiness and all these different things, why would I take action? Because taking action is only going to reinforce what I believe to be true about myself, right? So if we don't have that warmth and gentleness and kindness to allow for us to reframe the way we think about our journey, even if we're imperfect, like, man, I blew the budget that month, but, or we can say, you know what? I stuck to 70% of the budget. I've never stuck to 70%. You see that frame, that reframe? One is all or nothing. The other one is recognizing my progress. Maybe I didn't stick to the entirety of the budget, but if I stuck to 70% of it and I've never done that before, that's a win. If I stuck to 40% of it and I've never done that before, that's a win. And if I know comfortably that I can maintain 70%, then that becomes my new baseline. Let me at least hit 70%, see if I can get to 75%. I got 72. That's moving. If I regress, that's actually regression, is actually a part of the growth process. We should already expect that I'm going to have moments where I'm not going to hit the mark. And now what we can tell us is, well, I already knew that this was going to happen. I got that out of the way. Let me get it back together, and let me get on with the journey, because it's a part of the journey. You go. You got a couple of steps back, but I'm still further than where I started. Then I go, take a few steps back. But how we talk to ourselves in those moments is incredibly powerful. And so there's that whole notion of self-awareness, to be able to deal with our vulnerabilities in such a way that brings lightheartedness to it, that brings optimism to it. I'm not being defined, I'm being refined by the process. And knowing that it is a part of the journey. And because I'm experiencing this, I am on the right path. Let's go. That stuff is incredibly important. But when we're dealing with self-shame and we're doing this in isolation, we're not congregating, we're isolating. We don't then have opportunities to even engage in conversations to share our progress with other people that too would validate, girl, look at you.
I went through it too. I went through it too, because you're not alone. That's the number one thing. You are not alone. There's nothing new under the sun. And I promise you, if you would to share it with others more, you'd be able to be more supported.
Now,
So
Renard,
you don't have to hide in shame.
yeah, now you and I both know everybody's not worthy of your confidence. Okay. So, but that being said, you know the people who are, right? And you allow to yourself to be vulnerable about your journey with those individuals. And what's going to happen is that they're going to see you in a way that you don't have the capacity to see you. And in having those conversations will reinforce the type of internal self-talk I'm talking about. And then also having this external self-talk that reinforces the new self-talk as a system dynamic. If we look at Weight Watcher programs, running programs, or any type of programs that are successful, they're successful because there are trusted communities that people are navigating. What's sad to me, and I don't want to make this this is a Black community thing, but I'm speaking from just personal experience here. We struggle with vulnerability. And I think that there are very legitimate reasons why that is, because to be Black and to be perceived as inefficient, right, insufficient, kind of speaks to this historical context of slave trade, perceptions of Black individuals, things of that nature, so on and so forth. What I'm saying is that I think in this next few decades of growth of the Black community, I think that therein, that ability to own our journeys in such a way to where we're not looking for validation for people outside of the culture, for people who are not Black, to justify and validate that we've arrived, and that we own this journey for ourselves so that we can engage in our woundedness and vulnerability so that we can ultimately grow. Because if you cannot heal what you don't reveal, it's just not, it will fester like a rotten, it will fester like a sore and then run. Thinking about Langston Hughes, The Dream Deferred. Um, our greatest opportunity for growth is our capacity to engage with our vulnerabilities. And if we do that, I strongly feel with self compassion first, because now if we can treat ourselves kindly and gently, guess what? I can treat my spouse kindly and gently. I can be empathetic. I can be understanding of context, nuance. I can be patient, right? And I think it's just such a beautiful disposition to consider with finances, because finances are a connection to our relationships. Very emotional, very relational. So the very nature of being able to engage in this process in the way that I'm talking about it with compassion, to engage our wounds, if we have wounds. Everybody's not wounded in the same way, but we've all been wounded.
Mhm.
I think that that creates a space for a cultural shift and a cultural change that looks within self to generate and create wealth, as opposed to looking for outside sources to do it for us, whether to validate us or to put us on. And I think that we're in an amazing season. There's so many talented, extraordinary, gifted Black individuals that are walking the United States right now, that I think that the time is now. There's research that says for Black communities, it would take so many years to catch up with white notions of wealth and things of that nature. But this is the thing. When we start talking like that, it then creates this, and then it's like, why even try?
Right.
Let's not even focus on what somebody else got. I'm going back to social media and this or that, the other. And let's just focus on what do we have and what do we want to grow? And just mind our business, grow our business, and create culture and community around that. Let's focus on us. And guess what? We're worthy of that spotlight. We're worthy of that growth. We're worthy of wealth. We're worthy of healing. We're worthy of all these things that I'm talking about. And that does not have to be compared to anyone else. And what happens is that when you do that, guess what? You start building steam. Then people start looking at the Black community and start saying, yo, what are they doing? Like they're building, they're growing. Like, did we miss something? Were we not at the cookout?
Dominate in our lane. And that's what I tell people all the time. Learn to dominate in your lane.
Don't worry about what other people are doing, because it's a distraction and it creates negative self-talk. And the great ideas and the vision and the X, Y, and Z that you have, you don't do it because you're comparing your starting point to where someone's success is. That oftentimes there's so much more to that context and story that you don't know. I can't judge that person for their success. They may have earned it. They may not have. I don't know unless I see receipts, but I can't then internalize a message about someone that I don't even understand. I don't even know. It's not the most productive way in terms of pursuing wealth creation. Generally, if you want to create wealth, you actually have to be able to put up the blinders. You have to be able to focus on your business. You got to be able to grind it out. If you're constantly worried about what other people are doing, you're going to be swayed by the wind. You're going to be jumping from one project to the next. You're not going to be consistent with anything. Like, it just doesn't work. Anybody who's incredibly successful that we know today was successful in one lane, like you mentioned, Renarda. And what happens is that when you become successful in that one lane, people then perceive you successful in every lane. That's just how it works. But you got to be successful in one lane first and execute on that vision. And it's very difficult to execute on a vision if you're focusing on somebody else's vision. Just focus on your execution, things of that nature, and drive it with grace, with compassion, with care, with gentleness, because the journey is going to be all over the place. And if anybody needs to be in your corner, you do, because oftentimes people don't even believe until you become successful. Then people want to say, oh, I always knew you were going to do it. And they were nowhere to be found 5 years ago. It's the same story. It does not change. Everybody goes through it. They're not haters. They just don't have the vision. They don't have the capacity. They have their own baggage. They have their own stuff.
Okay, though. That's okay. That's the other part you have to say. That's okay too.
It's okay. And when they come back and we win in, I'm going to bring you back with warm arms and we're going to put you in position and we're going to keep winning. It just is what it is. We're all in our own spaces. We're all in our own season. But when we can be compassionate to ourselves, then we can understand the complexity of the lives, the situation, and the circumstance of others, so that we can be compassionate and empathetic to others as well. But I think a lot of this stuff starts with self, and it is a journey.
Mhm. Man, I love this. I hope you guys got your pen and paper because I'm taking copious notes. Because Dr. Thomas, you are giving us some valuable information. But understanding the influence of self-compassion kind of prompts us into let's talk about some practical ways to incorporate this into our financial wellness journey. So, how can we apply the principles of self-compassion in our day-to-day finances to ensure that we can promote financial well-being? So let's uncover some actionable strategies for integrating self-compassion into our financial lives. Like, I want our audience to walk away with something that they can actually start right away.
Yeah, there's gonna this. So this is something that I do with my clients. Um, is that so? This is the thing. When somebody works with me and they leave, they're going back to their lived reality and circumstances, right? So if you're in a session with somebody, guess what? There are no distractions. Very like palatable backdrop or ground if we're meeting virtually or whatever it may be. There's no sound. We're slowing down. Nobody's rushing you. Nobody's making an ask of you. It's almost like the outside world for at least an hour doesn't exist. That's not the reality of our lived experience before you walk in that door and when you walk out that door. Okay. So one of the things, well, there are two things. One is it's very important that you create a sacred space that you honor and you respect to do the work. Don't even focus on doing the work, but create the space. Everything that I just told you, I just set that up, right? When you came into the session, the reason why the session works is because we create the space for it to work, right? You're creating the nest. You're creating the comfort zone for you to be able to go to and say, all right, this is my space. And what's happening is that we're triggering an emotional response where psychologically and emotional otherwise is almost like a priming of the body to begin to commence with this thing. So the first step is to create the space. The second step is to use self-compassion phrases. And what I do is I encourage clients to come up with their own self-compassion phrases. If they need my help, I'll listen to their language during our session because they'll usually give me the language. And when I say it back to them, it's authentic, it's truth, it's reality, it's their verbiage. It's not me telling. So it's not even something that they have to remember because it really is who they are. And I think that's the beauty of the work that we do. It's not about me, it's about the person. So what I would encourage you to do is to come up with 3 gentle, kind, warm phrases that you say to yourself before you commence with the work. So you create the space. That's the external element of this where there's peace, there's lightness, there's no distraction. We create the internal self-talk. That's the internal space that we're now priming for the journey and the process. And then the last thing is to gradually build your process of doing things. Even if it's only 5 minutes, remember, this is not about I'm so super excited about this journey and I want to get everything done. That's your emotional state speaking. That does not have the capacity to think about all the elements that you have to navigate with the journey because one task literally is probably 10 other tasks under it that you haven't thought about that now we have to do these just to achieve the one. So we start with one task, we start small in just 5 minutes initially. Don't do any more than 5 minutes. So if working on your budget, if that's just opening up your Excel and getting clear on your line, we're not putting any numbers. All we're doing today is just opening up the budget, making sure that all the different expenses, just the names are listed there appropriately and they're titled appropriately. That's it for the day. We won. Give yourself a break that next day and say that I'm going to give myself a break. I'm going to go back to it 2 days from now. And then if you do another 5 minutes, I'm just going to input on my Excel sheet my income. That's it. I won. That's it. Take a break. And then just gradually build, at least for the first week. Because what you're doing is that you've made a commitment to yourself. You showed up. You did the work. That's a dopamine response. That's building your neural circuitry. And now you're building winning habits at the end. And that's all that really matters, quite honestly. Everything else works out consistently over time. And then next week we say that, all right, I'm going to do 10 minutes or 15 minutes. You can find wherever your sweet spot is.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, we have a cognitive capacity load where I know I can do about 7 or 8 minutes and then I start to feel overwhelmed. Then stop. That's fine. We know 8 minutes is our baseline, and then that's all we set. And then we gradually work that up from there. But eventually it becomes easier because you're starting to see progress. You're getting started, you're moving, and you're starting to get some momentum. So for me, those would be the big three things there. Create the external space where you go, honor the work. Create the internal space by having some self-compassion phrases. Mine is perfection is not required. Every time I sit down on a new project or something that I'm working on and I'm getting anxious because my brain just thinks about all the different things I need to get done, and maybe I'm overlooking something, and I can work through everything and it just becomes overwhelming. Perfection is not required. Perfection is not required. Perfection is not required. You just need to show up and allow your gifts to manifest themselves. That's going to happen. And your gifts will continue to be refined by showing up. But we can't even cultivate and develop our gifts if we don't have the capacity to show up. And then the last thing is to just set short time periods, understanding that now I have to develop the cognitive capacity to sit with this information in a duration of time that allows me to be the best version of myself in that time frame. And then once I've hit it, I stop. I don't want to exhaust my cognitive capacity, because my cognitive capacity is also going to be based on everything I've dealt with that day. Any conversation, anything that's going on at work, anything that's going on with family, whatever it may be. We have to understand that we're bringing subconsciously the weight of life into this context, even if we don't see it. So extend yourself some grace, and not thinking that I have to sit down for 2 hours to knock out X, Y, and Z. This is all about developing habits, building momentum. And then within about 2 months or 3 months, you actually get to a point to where you're not just doing it, but now you're excited about it. You're thinking creatively about, what if I do this and what if I do that? That didn't work last time. It wasn't I didn't work last time. It was that didn't work last time. What if we do this? What if we tweak this? And when I get to that space with clients, I know that I've won. When they're calling me and saying, this is what I did, they're not asking me anymore. They're basically telling me, this is what I'm thinking. This is what I'm doing. I just need you to tell me if I'm moving the right direction. We win it.
We win
right?
it.
So that's, for me, those would be the 3 takeaways that I would encourage. It's not just baby steps for the sake of baby steps. Mm-hmm. It's understanding the cognitive, emotional, and relational dynamics of what's actually happening inside of you that makes this successful. Now you understand human psychology and physiology, and it now starts to make sense. It's not just something you just do. It's actually the way that we're wired. So now we're working in alignment, generally speaking, with our wiring to promote successful and sustainable outcomes. Not something I do for a little bit and don't do it anymore, but something that I can continuously do over time with grace, kindness, and warmth.
But not only does this make sense, it also means that you're willing to trust the process.
Trust the process.
Like that's important to note, that you have to trust the process.
It's trust the process, but then also trust you. Mm-hmm. Because sometimes it's not even a process. Sometimes we just don't trust us in the process. It's our interaction with the process or the thing or the person or the money that we don't trust. So what happens is that you're actually building your capacity to trust self and depend on self to execute. And that's where agency and power comes from.
Love it. Oh, wow. Dr. Thomas, let's explore some ways to incorporate self-compassion as far as resources. I know a lot of you might be wondering, how can you find additional resources and support you throughout self-compassion as you're trying to implement this and add it to your financial well-being? Can you share, what would you suggest for somebody who wants to deepen their understanding even further with self-compassion?
Yes, there is a gentleman. Now, please don't be intimidated by the size of this book. His name is Gabor Mate. He actually created a therapeutic method called compassionate inquiry. And what's fascinating is that the more and more that I learned about compassionate inquiry, what I realized is that I've basically been doing exactly what this gentleman and researcher has been doing for almost 20 years. So for me, this is an incredibly powerful tool because he's already done the research to validate my inclinations and my therapeutic method and how I work with clients. So I don't have to recreate the wheel, and I don't have to act as if I came up with this either. So there's a book called The Myth of Normal, and if you have an opportunity and if you want to get like a free subscription of Audible so you can just listen to it, I would strongly encourage you over the rest of the month to take time and just to let this book be a part of your daily conversation. And you're going to hear a lot of things that I've touched on. He touches on these even more eloquently in a lot of different ways. And he's been doing this work for a very long time. But a lot of his work is rooted in addiction, and why people are addicted to the things that they're addicted to. So you've heard me say self-soothing often, right? Is that we create these adaptive responses to stress and things in our lives that our hope is that it provides us something, right? So when he would work with individuals who were dealing with addiction, he wouldn't shame them or judge them. He would ask them a very different question. He would ask them, what were you hoping to get from your addiction or the thing that you were addicted to? What benefit? He would use it from the perspective of what benefit did that addiction provide you? And then what you'll hear all the time over and over again is that he talks about the reason why I was strung out on drugs and things of that nature was because it would make me feel so incredibly warm. So people would use expressions of loved, like I was being hugged by my mother. That's deep.
Very
That's
deep.
context. That's nuance. That unless you go in and you pull the receipts and you understand what's coming from this. And what happened is that they have a maladaptive response to something in their life. And maybe drugs or a sex addiction or whatever it may be has been the way in which they've addressed that situation because of the way that it made them feel warmth, connection, kindness, peace of mind, at least temporarily for what they've been navigating. And then the trick there in terms of as he navigates this is that he gets people to start thinking about other ways in which they can experience a similar warmth, right? So this whole notion of compassion. So what happens then before someone ever gets to addiction, a maladaptive response, if we already engage in a process of internally engaging in a process of self-warmth, self-grace, self-kindness, self-gentleness, then that means that we don't have to seek externally to fill the void of something that we potentially could engage in a practice and process of filling internally. And I think that that's a stronger and healthier way of being. And so this book also corroborates with some research that I've done on looking at men. Well, not necessarily research, but I presented at a conference on this. One of the things I was interested in is fatherlessness in households and how that impacts the financial circumstances of individuals as they get older. And one of the things that became very evident in the 70s, because there had been a considerable amount of research that had been done in this area, was that gentleness, warmth, and unconditional love were all precursors to fathers rearing their sons and those men growing up into being confident, effective men. It wasn't you got to be strong, toughen up, do X, Y, Z, X, Y, Z. It was literally creating the space and environment so that their brains could develop without trauma or woundedness especially with men, because men tend to act out aggressively when wounded. So now you have men who are self-regulated. You have men who have the ability to communicate. You have men who are still strong and fearless and all these different things, but they're also tempered because they have emotional regulation and they have a healthy development of brain and mindset. So what's absolutely beautiful is that these threads going back to the 60s and 70s with all the research that have been done, nothing's really changed. The only thing that needs to change is that you said trust the process. We need to trust the data. We need to engage in our woundedness through compassion, and more specifically, self-compassion, because that gives us the power to own our own journeys instead of relying on somebody else to validate me before I ever begin. Because there's no telling when somebody will validate you. And you may have people in your system who don't want to validate you because they don't want to see you grow any more than you've already grown, because of now what that may mean to them in the context of your relationship. If you outgrow them, then now you may not want to be their friend, so they don't want to see you grow. This is just real human stuff, right? So if we're always waiting for people to validate us, it may not be that people don't want to, is that people may be even afraid to validate us because of what your growth may mean and how that may shake up their world as well. So it's how we self-own.
Growth too.
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, so Dr. Thomas, your book, I want to get into this before we wrap this conversation up. Your book, Financial Culture, Building Wealth from the Inside Out, has been garnered quite a bit of attention lately. So could you share with our audience a bit about your book, like what inspired you to write it and how can it serve as a valuable resource to those on their financial wellness journey? And let me just add, I've had the privilege and the honor to read your book. I loved it from front to back. Like, it's definitely a must read. You should have this on your shelf.
I appreciate you, Renarda. I really do. My book is about being seen. And so I work in academia. And oftentimes, when working in academia, prior to a lot of the cultural shift and conversations around diversity and equity and inclusion, was that oftentimes when you produce research, it was kind of very difficult to produce research that focus on a specific demographic. So if I just wanted to say I wanted to look at African American households for this, that, the other, I would literally have reviewers ask me, why is this important? And so they're the gatekeepers. And if I don't do what they're asking me to do, guess what? My work doesn't get published. And if your work doesn't get published and you're working at a research university, then you can't get tenure, right? So there's this, when you see it all the way through, there's this cascading scale. And the reason why I chose to get my PhD was because I wanted to put myself in a position to understand research in such a way so that I could bring real value to Black households, minority households, and generally speaking, any group of individuals that are marginalized. And I think that being seen is so incredibly important. Even if you go to the bookstore, there are books that are written by folks. But what I found is that many of these books are very paternalistic, which is more of the pull your pants up, get your credit right. Why aren't you investing? Without any subtlety and nuance of understanding, like, do you not live the Black experience? I'm not saying that those other things may not be necessary and important. If we think about other elements I don't want to get into at this point. But we have to approach this with empathy and compassion, because I don't want to read something where I'm feeling judged, where I feel like it's an indictment on me. And then I'm just going to shut down. I'm not going to read it. I'm not going to use the information. And it's like, okay, I read it, whatever. Mm-hmm. You get what I'm saying? So I wanted to write something that doesn't focus on money, but focuses on the hearts of individuals, that uses money as a way to engage in that conversation. And me being vulnerable. So this entire time we've been talking about vulnerability, compassion, empathy. I start the book with empathy. I end the book with compassion. And all throughout, I'm embracing my vulnerabilities and some very very deep wounds that I've had to struggle with and deal with. So it's not just a person who you're saying, oh, here's this PhD who's trying to tell me how to live my life. And I don't want to tell you how to live your life, quite honestly, because I feel that Black financial culture isn't something that somebody has to identify for you. It's something you identify for yourself. That's freedom. That's the whole point of freedom, is that you can choose in your circumstance if you want to live a lifestyle where you don't want to be mindful of money and you don't care. That's your choice. But if you know that you're making that choice, then you're expressing agency. And I respect your agency as an adult to do that. And I know that if you tap into that agency element, when you're ready to make a change, you already tapped into agency. So when you're ready to do different, you will do different because you're honoring your agency and your choices. So for me, this book wasn't about telling people what to do, how to do things. It was just to have a conversation with you about money, about trauma, about vulnerability, about healing, about forgiveness. But more importantly, that I believe that you have more power than you think. And before you own a stock, an investment, or anything else, I want you to own your power first. That's my only ask. I think everything else takes care of itself from there. So that's my book. It's more heart than it is money. Money is layered in. I use a lot of Black cultural references from hip hop and things of that nature to engage in conversations. But it's one of those books where if you saw it on a shelf, you would look at it and say, oh, that's for me. And I wanted that my first book to be a book for my family back at home in Gary, Indiana, for friends and people back at home in Gary, so on and so forth, in Flint, Michigan, in Detroit, Minneapolis, so on and so forth, where you could actually see something that was written for you unapologetically, and done tastefully and done with care and compassion. And that sees the beauty in you. And I don't think that we have enough of that. We have a lot of browbeating. We have a lot of, again, paternalistic, telling people what they do. If I made it, you can make it. I didn't make it by myself. There are a lot of circumstances and situations that had to play out the way that they played out for me to kind of fall in a peg. So some of it is effort. Some of it is luck. A lot of it's the grace of God. And I can't take the glory for any of it. I don't own it. I just keep showing up and doing the best that I can each and every day, despite my flaws. And so this isn't a book about somebody who's perfect telling you what to do with money. This is a book about somebody who's lived an imperfect life, who still struggles with his own personal journey with finances and relationship with money. It doesn't end. You grow, you get better at managing these things, but the thoughts and the emotional things that you deal with don't go away necessarily. And that's okay because it's a part of our lived experience. And because I have those experiences, and I know that other people share those experiences, then hopefully we can connect in a way, in an area of mutual respect, so that potentially you receive some of the messages that are in the book. But at the end of the day, it is still your choice, your agency, your power in terms of whether or not you want to take action. And I'm okay with that.
Wow, Dr. Thomas, as usual, I can talk to you for hours. Your conversation is always invaluable and on point. But throughout our conversation, audience, I know that Dr. Thomas has resonated with a lot of you, and we want to hear from you. And Dr. Thomas has been very kind enough to share 3 copies of his book. All you have to do is send an email with your mailing address, and 3 people will receive a copy of his book. The only thing we want, is for you to share with us your key takeaways. Did he step on your toes? Was there some strategies you're going to try? Tell us. We want to hear from you. And as we wrap up this conversation, I just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Thomas, for pouring into the audience tonight and sharing all of your insightful, valuable tips that you've given to us. It's a heartfelt thank you from me, just for being here.
Absolutely. Renarda, thank you for being consistent. You keep showing up, you keep fighting a fight. You're professional, you're on top of your stuff. I didn't answer your email for way longer time than I usually do. So I appreciate your patience and your grace. So thank you for how you are being very intentional about curating these conversations that will leave a lasting legacy in the hearts and minds of all the people in which you have contact with. So thank you for your work.
You're welcome. I also want to remind our audience that FinTalk conversation will continue this Wednesday at 6:30. And this conversation is just going to be a follow-up with this, where we're going to talk about the emotional intelligence and its connection to your financial decision making. So as a real estate entrepreneur and a wealth strategist, I'm very passionate about empowering individuals, as you can tell, to help you make informed, not just decisions, but informed financial decisions. My mission is really to help you shrink this intergenerational wealth gap. And it takes individuals like myself and Dr. Thomas to really hold this space. So again, I want to say thank you, Dr. Thomas, for being here. Be sure to mark your calendar so that you can join me on this enlightening conversations that I'm going to have throughout the month of April. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so that you can be notified of all of our conversations. We look forward to connecting with you. So until then, take care and stay empowered.